If you've ever walked into a room and forgotten why you're there, or opened your laptop and found yourself reading the same email 3 times because it feels like nothing is going in, and then immediately worrying that something is wrong with you because this is just not like you, then this video is for you. Because one of the things I hear most frequently from women in the clinic is that they just don't feel as sharp as they used to be. And now that I'm 41, this is also happening to me. It's that feeling where your brain feels like it's not just in the same gear as it has been. You can still function, you're still doing your job, running a household, and remembering everyone else's lives, but suddenly everything takes a bit more effort. And I think what makes this especially difficult is that women often feel quite frightened by it because nobody really warns you that perimenopause can affect your brain as much as your body. We hear about periods changing, hot flushes, sleep, but nobody really talks about the mental side of it, the multitasking difficulties, the word finding issues, and that strange mental overwhelm with things that used to be really easily handled. So in this video, I want to talk about perimenopause brain fog, what it actually is, what the research shows, what is and isn't happening, and also what helps. This is not a buy 27 supplements and start meditating at sunrise kind of video. These are realistic steps that you can actually fit into your already busy life that will have a high impact. Because what most women need in midlife is not more complexity, it's less friction and things that actually work. There's one part of the research in particular that I found very reassuring because it changed how I thought about perimenopause brain fog, but I'll come back to that in a minute. If you like to jump around the video, there's timestamps in the description below. Now let's crack on before I forget why we're here. I think it's first important to define what we mean when we say brain fog, and this will help us to know how to deal with it. Because it's not really a formal diagnosis, it's more a symptom or actually a cluster of symptoms. Things like forgetfulness, poor concentration, mental fatigue, difficulty multitasking, losing a train of thought. And one thing I think is important to say here is that these symptoms are all really, really common. In fact, there was a large menopause study which showed that about 40 to 70% of women reported cognitive symptoms during the transition through to menopause. What I want you to take away from this is that if it is happening to you, you're not alone. And that matters because a lot of women assume that they're failing, especially high-functioning women. They're women who are used to coping very well, managing complexity, have a lot of things going on. And then when things suddenly change, they start questioning themselves. This is what happened to me. And I think midlife in general is the perfect storm for this because hormones are fluctuating, women are raising children, they're working, they're often at a point of their career where they're quite, high up. They might be sleep deprived, they have elderly parents, and just huge mental loads. And then we're used to putting ourselves last. So it sometimes becomes difficult to separate out what's hormones, what's sleep deprivation, and what's just life. And the truth is, it's often not one thing. Perimenopause brain fog is probably best understood as like a network effect of all of the things that I mentioned, with cognitive overload, sometimes with metabolic health difficulties, maybe anxiety or mental health difficulties, and they're all interacting together. And that's important because it changes how we approach it. If the problem is multifactorial, then the solution usually is too. But before we talk about what helps, I want to talk about the part that I think reassures women the most, because the research here is actually really fascinating. Because what women feel is happening in their brain and what researchers actually see on cognitive testing are not the same. It turns out they're surprisingly different. And this is an important distinction because although women in perimenopause often report very significant cognitive symptoms, when researchers do formal cognitive testing, often overall cognition is still normal. And that might sound dismissive, but I actually think we can see it as being reassuring because it suggests that for many women, this is not a sign of dementia or permanent decline. It's more like a cognitive inefficiency. Your brain is still working, but it's just less efficient, less smooth. Things are less easy. There was one large menopause study called SWAN, which found something very interesting because normally when people repeat cognitive tests over time, they improve just through familiarity and practice. But when they tested women in perimenopause, these women didn't show the normal improvement to the same degree that you would expect. After menopause, that expected improvement returned. And I think this matches quite well how women describe this phase. It's not that their brain is gone, it's just that it requires more effort. And psychologically, that's an important distinction. because fear itself can make it more difficult to cope with and make it seem bigger than it is. The other important thing that is found in the research is that subjective brain fog symptoms correlate very poorly with global cognitive impairment. So what does this mean? It means that often you might feel cognitively impaired, but actually on an objective testing, there isn't a deficit. This doesn't mean your symptoms aren't real. It just means that our current mode of testing these things doesn't fully capture the female experience, the mental overload, the difficulty with organizing school and work emails after a terrible night's sleep. You don't need a neuroscience paper to tell you that your brain is suffering when you're trying to do these things. But what we do know from the research is that hormones do affect the brain, but it's not in a catastrophic way that it might feel like. Let's talk about what's happening biologically. Estrogen affects a number of systems: memory, attention, mood, neurotransmitters like dopamine and acetylcholine. And during perimenopause, hormones aren't just declining smoothly. They are fluctuating. And sometimes that fluctuation can be really dramatic. And that helps to explain why symptoms aren't always feeling consistent. Some days you might feel fine, other days are a catastrophe. There's also evidence that areas most affected may be things like verbal learning, memory efficiency, and that also fits in with the lived experience of perimenopause. It's not severe memory loss. It's why did I walk upstairs and what was I going to get from this room? And why does everything feel just that little bit harder? Sleep is also quite an important driver of this. In fact, I think it might be one of the most important and most underestimated drivers of brain fog in midlife, because even subtle sleep fragmentation can significantly affect your attention, your processing speed, your emotional regulation. And many women in perimenopause have been suffering from bad sleep for years, perhaps without fully recognizing how much it's affecting them. When you add in the hormonal changes that affect your sleep, like cortisol changes, anxiety, night sweats, and the modern life, like mental multitasking, constant notifications, no recovery time, decision fatigue, the brain is just not getting any space to rest and be quiet. And I think this overstimulation is something that affects us quite a lot. It's not that we're incapable, it's just that we have so much going on. This, again, helps inform the management, because it's not so much about boosting your cognition, it's more about reducing the things that are taking up cognitive bandwidth and making things worse. Many women might search for a magic supplement or a brain hack, but actually some of the highest impact interventions are so much more simple than that. So let's talk a little bit about management. And I want to be very evidence aware here, because there's a lot of nonsense online about menopause and brain health. First off, HRT. HRT is not currently supported as a direct cognitive enhancer. That's important because the evidence does not show that it reliably improves cognition or reduces dementia risk. And major guidelines specifically advise against using it for that purpose. This doesn't mean that it doesn't have a role, because, for example, if it helps improve your sleep because your night sweats improve and your anxiety improves, then that might indirectly improve your brain fog. And clinically, I absolutely see that. But I think framing is important. It's not that HRT is going to give you a super brain. It's that it might help to reduce some of the things that are contributing to your cognitive overload. The intervention that has some of the strongest evidence, however, is CBT for insomnia. This is interesting, I think, because it shows that treating sleep disruption has a major knock-on effect on cognition. And it also helped to change how I thought about brain fog, because instead of asking, how can I optimize the brain itself, I started thinking, what are the things that will indirectly affect it and have big impacts on improvement in general for women's health? So poor sleep, stress, anxiety, overcommitment, multitasking, maybe inflammation from metabolic health, alcohol. These kind of things, and you might not think of them as being brain enhancers, but actually they can have a big impact on optimizing your cognitive abilities at this point of life. And this is where I've personally become more interested in reducing friction rather than the optimization culture that I see so much online. Because I think that many women are already cognitively overloaded. They need systems that make life easier, not things that are going to add to your morning routine, a 27-step morning routine, an ice bath, a sauna, a complex exercise regime. It's actually things like reducing multitasking, not trying to do 5 cognitive tasks at a time. It's externalizing your memory, notes, calendars, reminders, systems to prevent you from failing and to support you. Because your brain was never designed to hold modern life in its entirety in your working memory. I also think that protecting sleep becomes almost non-negotiable in midlife. And not in a perfectionist way, but in a sleep is now a health brain intervention kind of way. Because one thing I've noticed personally is that my brain just functions better when I've had better sleep and when there's better margins, less switching, rushing, stimulation. These two things together, improving your cognitive load and improving your sleep, are going to have a big impact, because I think many brains are just saturated and undernourished from the rest that you get from sleep. Now, having talked about what I think has a big impact, there are also a lot of experimental or low evidence interventions online that you should probably proceed with caution. Things like brain stimulation devices, off-label stimulant medications, and certain supplements. They might be interesting from a research perspective, but often the evidence for these in terms of impacting menopause brain fog is very limited. So be careful of overselling. I think women especially can be vulnerable to spending huge amounts on money trying to fix themselves, when what they actually need is very simple things: better metabolic health, better stress regulation, less overload. I think we need to be really careful about not catastrophizing normal midlife cognitive aging, because some slowing in processing speed happens gradually with age in everybody. Menopause, perimenopause may amplify awareness of that, especially when it's layered with symptoms and stress. But that's very different from pathological cognitive decline. That said, not everything should automatically be blamed on perimenopause. And this is very important. If your symptoms are rapidly worsening, severe, associated with difficulty in functioning, neurological symptoms, or you're getting very confused, please get assessed properly. Dementia is very rare in the under 65s. There are other causes, medical causes of cognitive symptoms, things like thyroid issues, vitamin deficiency, depression, medication side effects. I don't ever want women to feel dismissed or for you to say this is just perimenopause. If you feel like it's not, then although it's important that we normalize brain fog and cognitive symptoms in menopause, perimenopause, it's also important that women are taken seriously. The thing I want you to take away the most from this video is that perimenopause brain fog is real. For most women, it does not appear to represent catastrophic cognitive decline. It's more often a sign that the brain is under pressure during a major hormonal and neurological transition. And I think, honestly, we need to give ourselves more compassion, not more self-criticism about this. Your brain just needs different support now than it did at 28. And that's not failure, that's adaptation. If you've experienced this yourself, I'd genuinely love to hear what you think, because often women experience this transition very differently. And if you enjoy evidence-based, realistic conversations around women's health, longevity, making midlife the best it can be rather than more complicated, then consider subscribing to my channel, because that's what I'm all about here. And I will see you in the next one.